Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the world's richest empire had run out of money. Not just short on cash. Completely trapped. An empire that once financed nations, controlled global trade, and dictated the flow of international finance, was suddenly staring into bankruptcy. In 1914, Britain wasn't simply another great power. It was the world's banker. Its financial network stretched across continents, from Hong Kong to Buenos Aires, Cairo to Calcutta. The British pound wasn't just a currency. It was the currency. International trade was settled in sterling. Governments borrowed in London. Gold flowed through British vaults. The City of London wasn't merely a financial center. It was the beating heart of the global economy. Britain didn't just govern colonies. It governed credit. And history has repeatedly shown one uncomfortable truth. Even the greatest empire is only as strong as its ability to pay tomorrow's bills. 3 years later, everything had changed. By 1917, Britain's national debt had exploded from roughly £650 million to more than £7 billion. Its overdraft with JP Morgan had climbed to almost $400 million. Every year, Britain was spending more than a quarter of its entire economic output just trying to keep the war alive. Money disappeared faster than taxes could replace it. Gold reserves shrank. Loans multiplied. Time was running out. Across the Atlantic, President Woodrow Wilson held the key. America had become the financial lifeline keeping Britain alive. And Wilson understood something few people appreciated at the time. Whoever controls the money, controls the war. The United States could tighten the flow of credit whenever it wished. And Britain knew it. For the first time in generations, the British Empire found itself dependent on someone else. The empire that had once dictated the rules of global finance now needed permission simply to survive. So, what does the most powerful empire on earth do when it's drowning in debt? Does it surrender? Raise taxes? Sell its colonies? No. It makes a promise. Not to a king. Not to a general. Not even to another empire. It writes a letter. Just 67 words long. A letter dated November 2nd, 1917. Today we know it as the Balfour Declaration. A document so brief it can be read in less than a minute. Yet its consequences have shaped more than a century of conflict, diplomacy, migration, and war. Most people have heard a simplified version of this story. Britain supported the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine during the First World War. End of story. But that's only one chapter. Behind those 67 words was a financial crisis unlike anything Britain had ever experienced. There were secret diplomatic agreements, competing wartime promises, powerful banking interests, imperial strategy, scientific breakthroughs, and a desperate government trying to prevent financial collapse before the entire Allied war effort fell apart. To understand why Britain promised land it didn't control, to people who largely didn't live there, without consulting the people who already did, we first need to understand just how close the British Empire came to running out of money. Because, without that financial catastrophe, the Balfour Declaration might never have existed. When the First World War began in August 1914, Britain entered the conflict in an extraordinarily strong position. Its national debt stood at only around 27% of GDP. Government finances had been carefully managed for decades. Balanced budgets were treated almost like a national religion. Britain wasn't borrowing from the world. The world was borrowing from Britain. London stood at the center of international finance. Its overseas investments equaled roughly 10% of the country's entire economy. Gold poured into British vaults from every corner of the globe. To many observers, British financial dominance seemed permanent. Then came the war everyone expected would be over by Christmas. Instead, it became the most expensive conflict humanity had ever seen. Britain had entered the First World War as the world's greatest financial power, but maintaining that power would prove far more difficult than winning battles. History often remembers wars by their battlefields. The Somme, Verdun, Passchendaele. But wars are not won by courage alone. They are won by factories, railways, banks, and balance sheets. Every artillery shell fired across the trenches represented money. Every battleship that steamed across the oceans consumed mountains of coal, steel, ammunition, food, and wages. Every single day the war continued, Britain burned through fortunes that had taken generations to build. At first, few people seemed concerned. After all, Britain was the wealthiest nation on earth. Surely it could afford a short war. But the war refused to end. Instead, it consumed everything. The traditional methods of financing war, raising taxes, issuing patriotic war bonds, and drawing upon national savings, began collapsing beneath the unimaginable scale of industrial warfare. The numbers soon became almost impossible to comprehend. By 1915, Britain's original war budget had already been exhausted. By 1916, the Treasury was borrowing at levels that would have seemed reckless only 2 years earlier. And by 1917, military expenditure had surged to more than half of Britain's entire economic output. Imagine a modern nation spending over 50% of everything it produces simply to keep fighting. That wasn't merely expensive. It was unsustainable. But Britain's greatest challenge wasn't simply paying its own soldiers. It had chosen to finance almost everyone else's war as well. France was bleeding money. Russia's economy was buckling under the weight of revolution. Italy struggled to fund its campaigns. Belgium, Serbia, Romania, and several smaller allies survived largely because British credit continued to flow. Britain had transformed itself into the financial backbone of the Allied alliance. Every ally depended on London, and London depended on borrowed money. The cycle was becoming increasingly dangerous. Taxes covered only a fraction of wartime spending. Everything else came from debt. And increasingly, that debt came from across the Atlantic. For more than a century, Britain had lent money to the world. Now, the world was lending money to Britain. It was one of the greatest reversals in financial history. Those loans didn't come from dozens of governments. Increasingly, they flowed through a single financial giant in New York. At the center of it all stood one institution, J.P. Morgan and Company. The famous American investment bank didn't merely assist Britain. It became Britain's financial lifeline. From the very first months of the war, Morgan acted as Britain's purchasing agent in the United States. Need rifles? Morgan arranged them. Need food? Morgan paid American suppliers. Need explosives, chemicals, uniforms, locomotives, trucks, steel, or grain? Morgan handled the contracts. Factories across the United States began operating around the clock. Millions of dollars poured from Wall Street into industries whose prosperity now depended on an Allied victory. Then came an even bigger step. In October 1915, J.P. Morgan organized a $500 million Anglo-French loan. At the time, it was the largest foreign loan Wall Street had ever witnessed. America's financial elite eagerly joined in. Industrialists, steel magnates, copper barons, bankers, investors. They were no longer simply observing Europe's war. Their fortunes were becoming tied to its outcome. At first, Britain paid by selling overseas investments and shipping gold across the Atlantic. But German U-boats transformed even that into a dangerous gamble. Every shipment risked disappearing beneath the ocean. Moving gold became increasingly difficult. So Britain relied more heavily on credit. Credit was faster, safer, and infinitely more dangerous, because every loan eventually demands repayment. By early 1917, J.P. Morgan held hundreds of millions of dollars in short-term British debt. The exposure was staggering. If Britain failed, Morgan faced enormous losses. If Morgan suffered catastrophic losses, Wall Street could panic. And if Wall Street panicked, America's booming wartime economy might begin to unravel alongside it. For the first time, Britain's survival was no longer just Britain's problem. It had become America's financial problem as well. The destinies of London and New York were becoming inseparable. Meanwhile, one man quietly recognized just how much power this new reality had created. President Woodrow Wilson. Unlike the bankers, Wilson wasn't interested only in protecting profits. He understood something far greater. Money had become a weapon, and whoever controlled American credit controlled the future of the war. For Britain, that meant its fate no longer rested entirely in London. It increasingly depended on decisions made in Washington and on Wall Street. Britain's financial crisis was no longer a distant possibility. It had become an emergency. Every passing week, officials inside the Treasury searched desperately for another way to keep the war alive. Taxes had already been pushed to painful levels. War bonds no longer brought in enough money. Gold shipments had become increasingly dangerous. And every new loan only added to an already overwhelming mountain of debt. Across the Atlantic, American banks continued extending credit. But one man was growing increasingly uneasy: President Woodrow Wilson. Although the United States remained officially neutral, Wilson watched as Wall Street became ever more deeply tied to Europe's survival. American factories were booming. Banks were earning unprecedented profits. Yet every new loan pulled the United States closer to a war it had not yet entered. Wilson feared something many financiers chose to ignore. If Britain collapsed financially, the consequences would not stop in London. The shock could spread across the Atlantic, triggering a financial crisis inside the United States itself. Determined to slow America's growing financial exposure, Wilson's administration, working alongside the Federal Reserve, began discouraging additional foreign lending and restricting the purchase of new foreign securities. On paper, it appeared to be nothing more than a cautious financial policy. In reality, it was a warning. Britain's financial lifeline had suddenly tightened. The timing could hardly have been worse. J.P. Morgan was preparing to organize another enormous Anglo-French loan, worth nearly $1.5 billion. That money was expected to finance the Allies' next major offensives. Wilson's decision threw those plans into uncertainty. Suddenly, Britain faced an impossible question. How do you fight the most expensive war in history when your largest source of credit refuses to keep lending? The answer was brutally simple: you don't. By the beginning of 1917, Britain's overdraft with J.P. Morgan approached $400 million. Every passing day increased the pressure. France was running out of money. Russia was sliding toward revolution. Italy depended upon constant financial support. The Allied coalition depended on Britain. And Britain depended on American credit. It was a chain of debt stretching across the Atlantic. Break a single link, and the entire structure could collapse. History usually remembers alliances between armies. Far fewer remember alliances between banks. Yet by 1917, accountants, financiers, and central bankers had become almost as important to victory as generals on the battlefield. Behind every shell fired, every battleship launched, every train loaded with supplies, someone had to pay the bill. Britain now stood dangerously close to financial collapse. Not months away, not weeks away. In some moments, only days from exhausting the cash needed to meet its immediate obligations. Imagine the consequences. The world's greatest empire, unable to honor its debts. International confidence could disappear almost overnight. Credit markets might freeze. Military contracts would be suspended. Factories would slow production. The Allied war effort itself could begin to unravel. The anxiety wasn't limited to London. Wall Street felt it as well. Because J.P. Morgan had become deeply invested in Britain's survival. The bank had arranged billions of dollars in loans, purchases, and financial guarantees. If Britain defaulted, Morgan itself faced extraordinary losses. For perhaps the first time in modern history, the financial stability of the United States had become closely tied to the survival of another empire. Washington now confronted a difficult choice: allow Britain to fail and risk a global financial crisis, support Britain, and inherit enormous influence over the future of the Allied war effort. Wilson chose the second path. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, private lending gradually gave way to direct government financing. It marked the beginning of a historic shift. For more than a century, London had stood at the center of global finance. Now, that center of gravity was slowly moving westward, toward New York. The transition would take years to complete. But history had already begun turning the page. Britain still possessed the world's largest empire. Yet even the greatest empire depends on confidence. And confidence disappears remarkably quickly once creditors begin asking difficult questions. It was within this atmosphere of financial desperation, political bargaining, and strategic uncertainty that another movement recognized an extraordinary opportunity: the Zionist movement. From this point forward, finance, diplomacy, science, and empire would become impossible to separate. To understand why, we must go back several decades. Every great political decision has a backstory, and the Balfour Declaration was no exception. Long before Britain's financial crisis, long before the First World War, long before diplomats gathered in London's government offices, Another story had already begun. It didn't start in Westminster or Washington. It began thousands of miles away, in Ottoman Palestine. During the late 19th century, Palestine was a province of the Ottoman Empire. Its population was overwhelmingly Arab, Muslims, and Christians who had lived there for generations. Scattered among them were long-established Jewish communities whose roots stretched back centuries. Life was far from perfect, but the land was neither empty nor politically forgotten. Then, events unfolding hundreds of miles away changed everything. Across the Russian Empire, waves of violent anti-Jewish pogroms devastated entire communities. Families fled. Villages were destroyed. Thousands searched desperately for somewhere safer to build a future. Among those watching these events with growing concern was one of Europe's wealthiest men, Baron Edmund James de Rothschild. Unlike many members of his famous banking family, Edmund wasn't primarily interested in politics. He believed something more practical. If Jewish communities were ever to build secure lives in their ancestral homeland, they needed land, farms, homes, schools, businesses, not simply speeches. Beginning in the early 1880s, Edmund quietly began funding agricultural settlements across Ottoman Palestine. He purchased land, paid outstanding debts, financed irrigation projects, imported farming equipment, built roads, supported vineyards, introduced new crops, established wineries that still operate today. Over the decades, his investments transformed struggling settlements into permanent communities. Villages such as Rishon LeZion, Zikron Yaakov, Rosh Pinna, and many others survived largely because of his financial support. By the beginning of the 20th century, Edmund had invested the equivalent of millions in modern currency across several decades. More than 100,000 acres of land had been purchased. Whether viewed as philanthropy, nation-building, or both, the results were undeniable. Long before the Balfour Declaration, a network of Jewish communities already existed throughout Palestine. This matters because history often gives the impression that Britain suddenly invented the idea of a Jewish homeland in 1917. It didn't. The groundwork had been developing for decades. The Declaration would not create these communities. It would give them something they had never possessed before: the backing of the world's largest empire. Meanwhile, political Zionism itself was evolving. Its best-known advocate was Theodor Herzl, whose vision extended beyond scattered agricultural settlements. Herzl imagined international recognition, diplomatic legitimacy, a formally recognized national home. Many Jewish leaders agreed. Others did not. Even within the Zionist movement, there was debate over methods, goals, and timing. History is rarely as unified as it appears in hindsight. The Rothschild family itself reflected these divisions. Some members strongly supported Zionist aspirations. Others feared that pursuing a separate homeland might fuel anti-Semitism in Europe by encouraging accusations of divided loyalty. There was no single Rothschild position, no unified family strategy. Instead, there were differing opinions shaped by different countries, different experiences, and different political beliefs. Yet one fact remained beyond dispute. When British officials examined Palestine during the First World War, they weren't looking at an empty map. They were looking at communities, schools, farms, businesses, and institutions that had been built over decades with substantial private investment. Those realities would heavily influence future negotiations. But Britain wasn't motivated by philanthropy alone. Its ministers had begun asking a different question. Could supporting Zionism also serve Britain's own wartime interests? As the war dragged into its third exhausting year, that question became increasingly important, because Britain's financial crisis was worsening. Its military position remained uncertain. Russia stood on the edge of revolution. American troops had barely arrived in Europe, and the government in London desperately searched for every possible advantage. Every alliance mattered. Every political relationship mattered. Every source of financial support mattered. Soon, those separate threads would begin to converge. Finance, diplomacy, empire, and one remarkable scientist whose work had nothing to do with politics, at least at first. History is rarely shaped by a single decision. It is shaped by countless events, occurring in different places, at different times, until they finally collide. By the beginning of 1917, Britain wasn't simply fighting Germany. It was fighting mathematics. Every week brought new military offensives. Every offensive consumed millions. Every million pushed the treasury closer to its limit. The war had become a race between the battlefield and the balance sheet. Yet while ministers struggled to finance an empire, another man was quietly solving a completely different crisis. His laboratory stood hundreds of miles from the front lines. But the work taking place inside would influence the course of the war, and, eventually, the future of the Middle East. His name was Chaim Weizmann. Unlike many political leaders of his era, Weizmann wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a banker. He wasn't even a career politician. He was a chemist. Born in what is now Belarus, Weizmann had established himself as one of the brightest scientific minds of his generation. By the outbreak of the First World War, he was teaching chemistry at the University of Manchester. At first glance, his research appeared to have little connection to the conflict consuming Europe. But wars have a way of turning obscure scientific discoveries into matters of national survival. One of Britain's greatest military problems wasn't a shortage of soldiers. It was a shortage of something far less obvious. A chemical, acetone. To most people, acetone is an ordinary industrial solvent. In 1915, it became one of the most valuable substances on Earth. Because acetone was essential for manufacturing cordite, the smokeless propellant that powered almost every British artillery shell fired during the war. No acetone. No cordite. No cordite. No ammunition. And without ammunition, even the world's most powerful navy becomes vulnerable. Before the war, Britain imported much of the raw material needed for acetone production. But Germany's naval blockade and wartime disruptions cut off those supplies. Suddenly, factories slowed. Production targets slipped. Military planners began worrying about something almost unthinkable. What if Britain simply ran out of ammunition? The government urgently searched for alternatives. Traditional manufacturing methods were painfully inefficient. Producing acetone from wood required enormous quantities of timber. It was expensive, slow, and nowhere near sufficient for modern industrial warfare. Britain needed a breakthrough. Fast. That breakthrough arrived in the form of bacteria. Weizmann had developed a fermentation process using a microorganism called Clostridium acetobutylicum. Instead of relying on scarce raw materials, the process converted starch into acetone on an industrial scale. What had begun as academic research suddenly became one of Britain's most valuable military assets. When Winston Churchill learned about the discovery, he reportedly wasted little time. According to Weizmann's own account, Churchill asked him a simple question. "We need 30,000 tons of acetone. Can you make it?" The challenge was enormous, but Weizmann accepted. He left university life behind. Working closely with British industry and government, he helped scale the process into full production. Factories were rapidly converted. New fermentation plants appeared. Before long, Britain's ammunition crisis had eased. Millions of artillery shells could once again roll off production lines. Few people outside government circles understood the significance. But inside Whitehall, Weizmann's reputation soared. He wasn't merely another scientist. He had solved one of Britain's most urgent wartime problems. That achievement opened doors few outsiders could ever hope to enter. Cabinet ministers knew his name. Military leaders respected his work. Senior politicians welcomed him into conversations that extended far beyond chemistry. For Weizmann, scientific success became political access, and political access became influence. It would prove invaluable, because while helping Britain solve its military crisis, he continued advocating another cause that had occupied him for years: the Zionist movement. Unlike earlier generations focused primarily on settlement and philanthropy, Weizmann believed lasting security required international recognition, support from a major world power, official backing. The timing could hardly have been more significant. Britain desperately needed allies, desperately needed influence, desperately needed every possible advantage. And Weizmann now occupied a unique position. He could speak as both a respected scientist and one of Zionism's leading representatives. Soon, those two identities would become impossible to separate. By the summer of 1917, Britain had reached a crossroads. Its armies were exhausted. Its finances were stretched to the breaking point. Russia was collapsing into revolution. American troops had entered the war, but they had not yet arrived on the battlefield in meaningful numbers. Time was running out. Every decision made in London carried enormous consequences. Military victories alone would no longer guarantee survival. Britain needed something more. It needed allies, influence,
money,
and every possible strategic advantage before Germany could recover its momentum. Meanwhile, Chaim Weizmann's influence inside Whitehall continued to grow. The scientist who had helped solve Britain's ammunition crisis now found himself speaking with ministers about something far beyond chemistry: the future of Palestine. It was in this atmosphere that conversations already taking place behind closed doors suddenly gained extraordinary importance. For years, British officials had maintained informal contact with leading Zionist figures. Now, those discussions became official. On February 7, 1917, representatives of the British government met with leaders of the Zionist movement. Among those present was Sir Mark Sykes. The name may sound familiar. Only a year earlier, Sykes had secretly negotiated the Sykes-Picot Agreement, dividing large portions of the Ottoman Empire into British and French spheres of influence. Now, he found himself discussing an entirely different future for Palestine. The contrast was remarkable. One year Britain had secretly negotiated territory with France. The next, it was discussing promises to Zionist representatives. The diplomatic puzzle was becoming increasingly complicated. Yet Britain continued moving forward, because every possible advantage mattered. As negotiations progressed, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour became more directly involved. Unlike some politicians who viewed Zionism with skepticism, Balfour believed the movement deserved serious consideration. His motivations remain debated by historians. Some point to genuine sympathy. Others emphasize imperial strategy. Many argue both were present at the same time. History rarely offers simple explanations. What is clear is that by June 1917, events accelerated dramatically. On June 19th, Arthur Balfour made an unusual request. He asked Lord Walter Rothschild and Chaim Weizmann to prepare a draft declaration expressing British support for a Jewish national home. Pause for a moment. Think about what that meant. The British government wasn't merely writing a diplomatic statement. It had invited representatives of the very movement receiving the promise to help draft the wording themselves. Few diplomatic documents begin that way. The first draft proved ambitious. It proposed that Palestine should be reconstituted as the national home of the Jewish people. Inside the cabinet, the wording sparked debate. Some ministers worried it went too far. Others feared international consequences. The language was gradually softened. Words were removed. Phrases carefully rewritten. Every sentence was weighed. Every adjective mattered. Diplomacy often turns on individual words, especially when those words may shape the future of entire nations. Behind these discussions stood another important reality. British leaders weren't thinking only about Palestine. They were thinking globally. Could public support for Zionism strengthen Britain's standing among influential Jewish communities in Britain, Europe, Russia, and, especially, the United States? Cabinet papers from the period show ministers openly discussing possible political and strategic benefits. Some hoped such a declaration might encourage stronger international support for the Allied cause. Others believed it could reinforce Britain's long-term position in the Middle East after the war. No single motive dominated every conversation. Instead, financial concerns, military strategy, imperial planning, political calculations, and personal relationships all became intertwined. The result was diplomacy unlike anything Europe had witnessed before. The declaration continued evolving through multiple revisions. Every department wanted changes. The War Office had concerns. The Foreign Office suggested modifications. Legal advisors examined the language. Cabinet ministers debated every phrase. Weeks turned into months. Outside government buildings, few people realized history was quietly being written. Inside Whitehall, one document passed from desk to desk. One paragraph, 67 words. Words that would outlive every politician who debated them. Finally, the cabinet reached its decision. On November 2, 1917, Arthur Balfour signed the letter addressed to Lord Walter Rothschild. It read, in part, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The declaration also included an important qualification. It stated that nothing should prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Those words would become the subject of intense debate for generations. Supporters viewed the declaration as a historic breakthrough. Critics argued it promised land Britain did not yet control. Neither side could fully anticipate what would follow. Because the declaration itself did not create a state, it did something far more subtle. It transformed an aspiration into official British policy. And once an empire commits itself to an idea, the consequences can echo for centuries. History remembers the Balfour Declaration as one promise. In reality, it was only one of three, and that changes everything, because while Britain was assuring Zionist leaders of its support, it had already made commitments to others. Different people, different governments, different expectations, all involving the same region. To understand why the Middle East remains one of the world's most contested regions, you have to understand these three overlapping promises. The first began in 1915. At that stage of the war, the Ottoman Empire still controlled much of the Middle East. Britain desperately wanted to weaken it from within. The solution seemed straightforward. Encourage an Arab revolt. If Arab leaders rose against Ottoman rule, thousands of Ottoman soldiers would be forced away from the main fronts. It was a gamble Britain was willing to make. So, London opened negotiations with Sharif Hussein bin Ali, the Hashemite ruler of Mecca. The discussions took place through a series of letters exchanged with Britain's High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon. Together, they became known as the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence. The message was simple: support Britain's war against the Ottoman Empire, and Britain would support Arab independence after victory. Exactly which territories were included remains debated to this day. The wording left room for interpretation. Some British officials later argued Palestine had been excluded. Many Arab leaders believed the opposite. For Sharif Hussein, the promise seemed clear enough. He accepted. In June 1916, the Arab revolt began. Across the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, Arab fighters attacked Ottoman railways, forts, and supply lines. One British officer would become especially famous during the campaign, T.E. Lawrence, better known to history as Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence helped coordinate operations between British commanders and Arab forces. His reports praised their determination. His writings later transformed the campaign into legend. Together, Arab forces captured key cities, disrupted Ottoman communications, and tied down thousands of enemy troops who might otherwise have reinforced other battlefronts. They believed they were fighting for independence. Many expected Britain to honor its word. But even while those letters were being exchanged, another negotiation was unfolding, in complete secrecy. In May 1916, British diplomat Sir Mark Sykes met his French counterpart, François-Georges Picot. Their objective wasn't Arab independence. It was something entirely different: the division of the Ottoman Empire. Using maps spread across conference tables, they drew lines dividing future spheres of British and French influence. The agreement became known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Large portions of the Middle East were allocated between the two European powers. Some regions would fall under direct administration, others under political influence. Palestine occupied a special position. Rather than assigning it exclusively to Britain or France, the agreement proposed some form of international administration. Exactly what that meant remained intentionally vague. One thing, however, was unmistakable. The agreement conflicted with expectations created by Britain's discussions with Sharif Hussein, and that was precisely why it remained secret. Had Arab leaders learned of it during the war, the revolt might have collapsed. Trust would have vanished. Britain couldn't afford that risk, so the agreement stayed hidden. For now. Then came 1917, and with it, the third promise, the Balfour Declaration. This time, Britain expressed support for establishing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. 3 years, 3 commitments, 3 different audiences. Each believed Britain was acting in good faith. Each expected something different. The contradictions weren't immediately obvious, because each promise served a different wartime objective. The correspondence with Hussein encouraged revolt against the Ottoman Empire. The Sykes-Picot Agreement secured cooperation with France. The Balfour Declaration sought strategic and political advantages as the war entered its decisive phase. Viewed individually, each decision appeared understandable. Viewed together, they formed a diplomatic maze that no one could fully escape. For decades afterward, historians, diplomats, and politicians would argue over which promise carried greater legitimacy. Each side found evidence supporting its position. Each interpreted the documents differently. Yet one uncomfortable reality remained. The people actually living in Palestine had played almost no role in negotiating any of them. Their future was being discussed, drafted, and debated thousands of miles away, in government offices, conference rooms, and private correspondence. History often speaks of treaties, but treaties rarely ask permission from those whose lives they transform. But history rarely ends with a single document. The Balfour Declaration had been written. The promises had been made. Yet the greatest consequences still lay ahead. Britain would soon inherit Palestine. Millions fleeing persecution would change its future. An empire would struggle to keep control. The world would witness another global war. And from its ashes, a new nation would be born, alongside a conflict that continues to shape our world today. The final chapter begins next. The guns finally fell silent. On November 11, 1918, after more than 4 years of unimaginable destruction, the First World War came to an end. Millions were dead. Entire cities lay in ruins. Empires that had dominated Europe for centuries had disappeared almost overnight. Germany's empire had collapsed. Austria-Hungary had fragmented. The Ottoman Empire was finished. On paper, Britain stood among the victors. But victory came at a staggering price. The empire that had entered the war as the world's greatest creditor emerged buried beneath mountains of debt. Its overseas investments had been sold. Its gold reserves had been depleted. Its economy had been transformed by years of relentless military spending. The financial center of gravity was quietly moving west. From London to New York, Britain had won the war, but it had lost something equally important: its unquestioned financial supremacy. Yet despite these enormous burdens, the empire now faced an entirely new responsibility: administering vast new territories carved from the defeated Ottoman Empire. Among them, Palestine. In 1920, the newly created League of Nations granted Britain the mandate for Palestine. Officially, Britain would govern the territory until its people could eventually achieve self-government. In practice, the mandate asked Britain to accomplish 2 goals that would become increasingly difficult to reconcile. First, it was expected to facilitate the establishment of the Jewish national home envisioned in the Balfour Declaration. Second, it was expected to safeguard the civil and religious rights of the territory's existing population. On paper, the objectives sounded compatible. On the ground, reality proved far more complicated. Jewish immigration gradually increased during the 1920s. Some immigrants arrived seeking opportunity. Others came fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. New towns expanded. Agricultural settlements grew. Investment flowed into infrastructure, education, and industry. Many newcomers viewed Palestine as a place where generations of uncertainty might finally give way to security. At the same time, many Arab residents watched these changes with growing concern. Land ownership patterns began shifting. Economic competition intensified. Political uncertainty deepened. What one community viewed as hope, another increasingly viewed as displacement. Mutual distrust grew year after year. British administrators found themselves caught between competing expectations. Zionist organizations demanded that Britain fulfill the promises contained in the Balfour Declaration. Arab leaders argued that Britain had ignored the principle of self-determination. Each side accused the administration of favoring the other. Each believed Britain had failed to honor earlier commitments. The balancing act became almost impossible. Small disputes became larger confrontations. Local tensions evolved into political crises. Violence, once sporadic, became increasingly frequent. Riots erupted in several cities. Communities that had lived alongside one another for generations found themselves separated by fear and suspicion. Every attempt at compromise seemed to satisfy no one. British commissions traveled repeatedly to Palestine. They investigated unrest, collected testimony, published reports, recommended reforms. Yet the underlying contradiction remained unresolved. How could Britain simultaneously encourage one national project while reassuring another population that its future remained secure? The mandate contained no simple answer. As the decade drew to a close, another storm was gathering beyond the Middle East. In Europe, political extremism was rising, economic collapse was spreading, and within a few years, events unfolding in Germany would transform Palestine more dramatically than anyone in London could have imagined. In Europe, the world entered one of the darkest chapters in modern history. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Few could have predicted how rapidly events would unfold. The Nazi regime moved quickly to dismantle democracy. Political opponents were arrested. Independent newspapers were silenced. Trade unions were dissolved. Power became concentrated in a single dictatorship. At first, many German Jews hoped the situation would stabilize. Germany had been their home for generations. They had fought for Germany during the First World War. Many believed the hostility would eventually fade. Instead, the persecution intensified. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped German Jews of their citizenship. Marriage between Jews and non-Jews was prohibited. Professional careers disappeared almost overnight. Businesses were boycotted. Families found themselves increasingly isolated. For thousands, leaving Germany became the only remaining option. But finding somewhere willing to accept refugees proved extraordinarily difficult. Many countries imposed strict immigration quotas. Others simply closed their doors. One destination remained open: British Mandate Palestine. Jewish immigration accelerated dramatically during the 1930s. Entire families arrived carrying little more than a few suitcases and hopes of rebuilding their lives. Cities expanded rapidly. New industries emerged. Universities grew. The economy modernized at remarkable speed. But every new arrival also intensified fears among the Arab population. Many believed demographic change threatened their future in their own homeland. By the middle of the decade, tension had become impossible to ignore. The next crisis was already approaching. The crisis arrived sooner than Britain expected. In April 1936, a wave of unrest spread across Palestine. What began as isolated attacks quickly evolved into a nationwide uprising. Arab political leaders declared a general strike. Businesses closed. Railways slowed. Ports fell silent. For 6 months, economic life across much of Palestine came to a standstill. The strike soon transformed into armed rebellion. Roads became increasingly dangerous. Railway lines were sabotaged. Government offices came under attack. British patrols found themselves facing an insurgency unlike anything they had previously encountered in the Middle East. London responded by sending thousands of additional troops. By the end of 1936, more than 20,000 British soldiers had been deployed throughout Palestine. Checkpoints appeared across major cities. Curfews became routine. Entire villages were searched. Military operations expanded into the countryside. The violence affected everyone: Arab civilians, Jewish communities, and British personnel alike. The conflict was no longer a political disagreement. It had become a full-scale security crisis. Hoping to find a lasting solution, Britain established another royal commission, led by Lord Peel. The commission spent months traveling across Palestine. It interviewed Arab leaders, Jewish representatives, British officials, and ordinary civilians. Its conclusion would become one of the most controversial recommendations Britain had ever produced. For the first time, Britain proposed dividing Palestine into 2 separate states, one Jewish, one Arab. Jerusalem, along with the surrounding holy sites, would remain under permanent British administration. The proposal stunned both communities. Some Zionist leaders viewed partition as the beginning of future statehood. Others believed the proposed Jewish state was far too small. Arab leaders rejected the plan entirely. They argued that Palestine should remain a single independent Arab state. Instead of reducing tensions, the proposal deepened them. Violence continued. Trust collapsed even further. And Britain found itself no closer to a solution than when the revolt had begun. As Europe moved ever closer to another catastrophic war, time was running out. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Within days, Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun. For Britain, the conflict demanded every available resource. Military attention shifted away from Palestine toward a struggle that would consume nearly every continent. But events unfolding in Europe would soon reshape Palestine more profoundly than any British policy ever had. As Nazi Germany expanded across Europe, Jewish communities found themselves trapped beneath an increasingly brutal regime. One discriminatory law followed another. Businesses were confiscated. Citizenship was stripped away. Families lost their homes. Entire communities were forced into isolated ghettos. Then, the persecution escalated into systematic extermination. Millions of Jewish men and children were murdered during the Holocaust. It became one of history's greatest human catastrophes. For survivors, Europe no longer felt like home. Hundreds of thousands found themselves living inside displaced persons camps after the war. Many had nowhere left to return. Entire families had disappeared. Entire communities had ceased to exist. For countless survivors, Palestine represented not simply hope, but survival itself. Jewish immigration toward Palestine increased dramatically. Yet Britain remained bound by the White Paper of 1939. The policies severely restricted Jewish immigration, even as refugees desperately searched for safety. Ships carrying Holocaust survivors crossed the Mediterranean. Many hoped to reach Palestine. Some succeeded. Others were intercepted by the Royal Navy. Passengers were often transferred to detention camps rather than allowed to enter the Mandate. The immigration crisis quickly became an international controversy. Across Palestine, sympathy for European Jews grew within the Jewish community. Frustration toward British immigration policy grew even faster. At the same time, thousands of Palestinian Jews volunteered to fight alongside Britain against Nazi Germany. In 1944, the Jewish Brigade was officially established within the British Army. Its soldiers fought in Italy during the final stages of the war. Many gained valuable military experience that would later prove significant. Meanwhile, Britain emerged victorious in Europe. But the cost of victory was enormous. Its economy had been devastated. Its military was exhausted. Its empire stretched further than it could comfortably govern. And Palestine was becoming one of Britain's most difficult responsibilities. The war had ended, but a new conflict was only beginning. The Second World War was over. But in Palestine, peace did not return. Instead, the conflict entered an entirely new phase. Jewish frustration with British immigration restrictions reached its breaking point. The White Paper remained in force. Holocaust survivors continued arriving in Europe with nowhere to go. Yet Britain still refused to allow unrestricted immigration into Palestine. For many Zionist organizations, the British Mandate was no longer seen as a protector. It had become an obstacle. Underground Jewish organizations expanded their operations. The Haganah continued preparing for the possibility of future conflict. The Irgun, led by Menachem Begin, adopted increasingly aggressive tactics against British rule. Another smaller organization, Lehi, believed Britain itself had become the primary enemy. Throughout 1945 and 1946, British military installations, railways, police stations, and government offices became frequent targets. British authorities responded with mass arrests, curfews, weapon searches, and military operations throughout Palestine. Neither side appeared willing to back down. Then, on July 22, 1946, the conflict reached one of its most dramatic moments. The King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which housed the headquarters of the British administration, was destroyed by a massive explosion. 91 people were killed. British officials, Jewish civilians, Arab civilians, and employees from several nations. The bombing shocked the entire world. The Irgun stated that warnings had been issued before the explosion. British authorities disputed whether those warnings had provided sufficient time. Regardless of the circumstances, the attack transformed international opinion. Britain now faced growing pressure both inside Palestine and abroad. Yet even after the bombing, the immigration crisis remained unresolved. Another single ship captured the world's attention. In July 1947, the Exodus 1947 departed France, carrying more than 4,500 Jewish refugees. Many were Holocaust survivors. The ship never reached Palestine. British naval forces intercepted it before arrival. The passengers were removed and eventually returned to Europe. Newspapers across the world published photographs of exhausted refugees being forced off the vessel. International criticism intensified. Britain increasingly appeared trapped, unable to satisfy either Arabs or Jews, unable to enforce peace, and unable to find a political solution acceptable to both communities. By 1947, the British government reached a conclusion. It could no longer solve the Palestine question alone. Instead, it transferred the issue to the newly created United Nations. An international committee, known as UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, was sent to investigate conditions on the ground. Its members traveled throughout Palestine, interviewed Jewish leaders, Arab representatives, British officials, military commanders, and ordinary civilians. After months of investigation, the committee reached its recommendation: partition. Once again, the world returned to the same solution first proposed a decade earlier by the Peel Commission. But this time, the decision would not belong to Britain. It would belong to the international community. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted on Resolution 181. The proposal recommended creating two independent states, one Jewish, one Arab. Jerusalem would become an internationally administered city. The resolution passed. Celebrations erupted across many Jewish communities. Many viewed the vote as the long-awaited international recognition of Jewish statehood. Across much of the Arab world, the reaction was entirely different. Arab leaders rejected partition, arguing that the United Nations had no right to divide Palestine against the wishes of its Arab majority. Within hours, violence erupted across Palestine. Roads became battlefields. Cities divided into armed neighborhoods. Convoys were attacked. Communities fortified themselves. The British, still officially governing the territory, increasingly stood aside while preparing to leave. After nearly 3 decades, the mandate approached its end. On May 14, 1948, Britain lowered its flag over Palestine. Nearly 3 decades after accepting the mandate, it walked away. The State of Israel had been declared. War immediately followed, but Britain's role in Palestine was over. Whether the Balfour Declaration was driven primarily by wartime strategy, imperial ambition, humanitarian considerations, financial pressure, or some combination of all four, historians continue to debate. What is beyond dispute is that decisions made in London during and after the First World War reshaped the Middle East forever. The financial crisis Britain faced after 1918, the promises it made during the war, and the policies it pursued in Palestine created consequences that would last for generations. A century later, the echoes of those decisions can still be felt across the region.